Good afternoon, class. Today I want to talk about various virtues that and states of mind that I see recommended both in the Sufi tradition and in positive psychology. Uh, and we'll start with William James, the great early American psychologist, who spoke about the mystical experience, what he called a mystical experience. Um, Many authors, William Chittick and Carl Ernst amongst them, have uh, discouraged the use of the word mysticism for Sufism. This is because, in part, mysticism has come in our positivistic times, oriented towards the empirical, often to become associated with, frankly, flaky ideas, New Agey ideas, and so forth. And Sufism, as I've tried to emphasize, was a majoritarian movement in much of Muslim history. So it wasn't a fringe, and moreover, there were lots of Sufis who emphasized ethics or asceticism much more than they did alternative consciousness or transcendent experience. Um, and those are the phrases that I would use for what James refers to as the mystical experience. Um, and we've already covered in some detail uh, Csikszentmihalyi and his idea of flow, which seems to come out of an activity that people really enjoy doing and get to do really well. And at that moment when they achieve flow, their time sense is deeply altered. They have heightened feelings of well being and happiness. Um, and it's been suggested that transcendent experiences of a spiritual sort are a kind of flow. And that may well be. I think we need more research to nail that down. In James's early 20th century account, which was more analytical than it was empirical, he argued that that the transcendent experience is ineffable, that it's experienced by people, and afterwards they're unable to put into words exactly what they felt. It's hard to describe. Um, it is a form of knowledge, or at least it's experienced as a form of knowledge. People think they have learned something from having such an experience, but it's intuitional, experiential, rather than rational. It doesn't have the form of a syllogism. Uh, the great medieval Sufi Nasafi says that one who hears a description of sugar cannot necessarily understand what sugar really is, but if you put a cube of sugar on someone's tongue, they immediately know what sugar is. And Sufism often preferred this experiential form of knowledge. The third element in James's account of transcendent experiences is that it's ephemeral, that it's transient, it doesn't last very long. People who've had such experiences talk about it lasting for moments or possibly for hours, sometimes even days. But it's not something that one experiences constantly every day. On the other hand, some Sufis um, do maintain that if this experience is reinforced, they call it tamkin, and built into one's ongoing life, it can become a constant experience. And that person, according to Nasafi, who achieves this continual state of transcendence is the perfect person. Nasafi, according to Lloyd Ridgen, says that nothing is concealed for this perfect person. They have reached and recognized God. And after recognizing God, they have understood and seen all the substances of things as they really are. Thereafter, they regard no task as more important or better than bringing comfort to people. The perfect person does not consider any comfort better than engaging in and perfecting others. So remember, we talked about in Mahayana Buddhism this idea of the bodhisattva. This idea of the perfect person in Sufism seems to me a very similar ideal. And the goal then of the perfect person in Sufism is to help others obtain salvation in this world and the next, to have well-being in this world and in the afterlife. So one of the things one takes away from these descriptions of the transcendent experience is that although it is a personal experience, it's experienced personally, it has implications for the individual's life thereafter, including an orientation towards welfare of others. The article I gave you to read by Nasafi and his colleagues from 2013 talks about the intersection of psychology and Sufism, and let me go over some of its salient points. Nasafi describes the ultimate goal of the Sufi as communion with God through spiritual realization, which is achieved, he says, through knowledge and practice. The Sufis, in his telling, imagine the person to be made up of heart, spirit, and conscience. That's the soul has those elements and has the capacity to know God, or as I said, it's common in Sufism to refer to God impersonally as the ultimate truth. There are three aspects, Nasafi says, of faith: obeying religious laws. The Muslim Sharia is being spoken of, acting in the physical world, he says, with limbs. The second element of faith is the path, which is pursued by speaking, by virtuous speech. And then the third is reality, seeking reality, which is acknowledged by the heart. So we think a little bit about some of these values. I wanted to put them in the context of the readings we're doing in Attar and Rumi. So Attar tells the story of Bayezid Bistami, who is said to have gone to Mecca, and he gets the bad news there. The angels tell him that of 600,000 pilgrims to Mecca, not one's pilgrimage has been accepted. And pilgrimage to Mecca is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's something that a committed Muslim should do once in a lifetime at least, if they can afford it. You're not allowed to be in debt. You have to be free and clear and able to do it. But it is a pillar of Islam. And so he gets this news that their pilgrimage is not being spiritually accepted, except for that of a man named Abdullah Mubarak of Damascus. And his pilgrimage was accepted even though he didn't go on pilgrimage. he just stayed home. So Bayezid goes to Syria, and Mubarak says, I had saved up 350 dirhams from my cobbling to go to Mecca. But a neighbor burst into tears that her children had been hungry for 3 days, and she had hacked off a piece of dead donkey on the road and cooked it up for them. So he said, my heart burned within me when I heard her tale. I took out my 350 dirhams and I gave them to her. He said, spend these on your children. This is my pilgrimage. So this story, and we'll see another like it, emphasizes that the outward form of religion, participating in conventional ritual life, is not as important for this kind of Sufism as living in a highly ethical way. And so fulfilling the needs of others, comforting others, feeding others, is being said to be more important in ascending these spiritual ladders than mere ritual performance, if that is done kind of with a cold heart in an unreflecting way. So Sufism often has an almost scholastic interest in laying out the path of the seeker of truth. The wayfarer and the seeker is called a wayfarer, and the Sufis imagine the spiritual path as a journey. So the wayfarer, when you do a journey, you have stops along the way. You have to stop for food, you have to stop for water, you have to stop to rest at night. So they talk about waystations, places that the pilgrim on the way to truth will stop, and those are called maqamat. And they're sometimes listed, struggle, repentance, self-denial, trust in God, poverty, remembrance of God, patience, contentment, and love. And again, these virtues are things that the Sufis thought that people could strive for and achieve by their spiritual discipline and effort. And they tell stories about the great Sufis to try to illustrate some of these ideas. Here's a story by Attar about the early woman Sufi Rabi al-Adawiya. And as a historian, I'm not alleging that this story is true. These are tales that are part of the folk literature of Sufism. With regard to contentment, it is said that Rabia once saw a man with a bandage tied around his head, and she asked him why. And he said, because he has a headache. So she asked him, well, how old are you? He said, 30. She said, have you been in pain and anguish the greater part of your life? He said, no. And she says, well, for 30 years, you didn't have a headache. You enjoyed good health, and you never tied a bandage of thankfulness around your head. Now you have a headache, you just put a bandage of pain around your head. The point of this story is that he's lacking in gratitude and contentment and those virtues that the Sufis are recommending. There's another story about Bayezid Bistami in Attar that Hatem said to his disciples, whoever of you on the day of resurrection does not intercede for the inhabitants of hell, he is not one of my disciples. So in Islam, as in Christianity, if you commit evil deeds, if you're wicked, you go to hell. And however, God is all powerful, and it's been shown by Muhammad Khalil that a majority of the great theological thinkers of later Muslim centuries believed that ultimately the denizens of hell would be released by God's mercy. And so the statement of Hatim was reported to Bayezid. He said, he is my disciple who stands on the brink of hell and takes by the hand everyone being conveyed to hell and dispatches him to heaven and then enters hell in his place. So the first story that Hatim told was about intercession, about praying for other people, having goodwill towards them, wanting to see even the wicked released from their torture. But Bayezid upped the game by insisting not only on that, but by active intervention, so trying to keep people out of hell, and then self-sacrifice. So those are the virtues that the Sufis were urging one to cultivate. Love is among those virtues. So Attar tells another story about Ma'ruf al-Karhi from Baghdad. He said that his friend Sari Sakati says, one festival day I saw Ma'ruf picking date stones. And I asked him, why are you doing that? Why are you picking dates? He said, I saw this child weeping. I asked him, why are you crying? He said, I'm an orphan. I have no father, no mother. The other children have new clothes and I have none. They have nuts and I have none. So Maruf was gathering these dates to sell them and buy him nuts so that he might run along and play. Sari, on hearing this, has some money, so he just buys the child some nuts. And he says, immediately I saw a great light shine in my heart and I was transformed. So this random act of kindness for a stranger, he didn't know this orphan, gave him this transcendent experience. And that brings us to beyond the waystations. The Sufis think that there are states of consciousness, ahwal, which are not something that you can attain on your own. They're gifts from the divine. They're a form of grace. And then the third and final stage, once you've traversed the waystations and the states of consciousness, is attainment of divine knowledge, and the Sufis would say union with God. So transcendent experience, alternative states of consciousness are valued in some Sufi traditions, and Sufis speak of these spiritual experiences as an awakening, as drunkenness. Psychologists have tried to study these experiences, and one study found that they have characterized across the religions, that is to say, people have these experiences in all the religions, and they may use different imagery for them, but they seem to have some commonalities across culture. So there's an unusual sense of the passage of time. Time might slow down or it might go very fast. There's the unusual sense of the extension of place, in the differentiation between objects in the external world. Things seem to be melded. The differentiation between the self and the external world is broken down, so one feels this sense of oneness with trees and lakes. And it's characterized by a sense of timelessness. And then often people will speak of union with a supernatural reality. Nizami also talks about the findings in the psychological literature on these transcendent experiences. They occur in the domains of thought, perception, and feeling. Um, when you ask people on scales, have you had these kinds of experiences? Uh, you get a wide range of answers, and it seems to be that some 20 to 45% of people will report that they have. So it's not universal. Uh, as the Sufis recount these experiences, they're immediate. They don't last long, as we said. They're beyond verbal description. So they sound a lot like what William James was talking about. They involve an intimate association with a presence beyond the self. They transcend time, space, and person. And they're often accompanied by a deep sense of joy, of bliss. Some of these transcendent experiences are accompanied by visions, what psychologists would call hallucinations, both auditory and visual, whereas hallucinations are typically a sign of pathology. So, clinical depression could produce them. Various other kinds of mental pathologies can produce uh, uh, hallucinations of various sorts. These spiritual visions and auditions don't seem to be associated with illness, and the people who have them test out fine in every other way. These phenomena haven't as yet been well studied, and you can imagine why. People who are having these experiences aren't necessarily in a psychology lab to be tested while they're having them. Uh, Many in the Sufi tradition speak of an ultimate transcendent experience of a feeling of annihilation of the self in the ultimate reality, and the technical term here is fana. But more frequently, they um, report experiences such as transcendence, deep sense of tranquility or calm, and this sense of pleasure and detachment. Again, we're following Nizami's account. He also points to some neurobiological studies of transcendent experiences. These haven't, to his knowledge, been done specifically with regard to Sufism, but they've been done with regard to other spiritual traditions which report very similar experiences. Uh, these transcendent experiences also come out of near death experiences, uh, or when people are under the influence of drugs. It's well known that epileptics sometimes have them. But again, although they can be produced by these extraneous influences, uh, studies have shown that religious individuals that have mystical experiences are functional by all the criteria, biological, cognitive, economic, health, etc., that you might have. So the Nizami is saying it politely. They're not crazy. They're not deviant. They're not abnormal. They're not. Their functioning is not impaired. Um, and there is as we discussed with regard to Rick Hanson's and his colleagues' book, there is often a substrate of brain function that is involved in these experiences, specifically the superior parietal lobule, um, and also some other parts of the brain. They're in the prefrontal cortex, so they're in the part of the brain that ordinarily does rational calculation, is able to look towards the future, does impulse control, but these altered uh, consciousness states also do seem to have those parts of the brain as their substrate. We also discussed with regard to um, Carr's work on the history, on the positive psychology, that neurotransmitters are involved in these experiences, especially serotonin and dopamine. Um, and they've been associated with these traits of self-transcendence, which is different from a ongoing uh, sort of subjective well-being. A trait is a characteristic, uh, and Nizami points out that such experiences are also sometimes associated with drugs, with psychedelics. I know in India, the Sufi orders often used what was called bhang, which is, I think, a strong form of marijuana. But most of the stories about the Sufis don't speak of uh, external aids to these experiences. They're something that can happen when one is perfectly sober. Um, Psychologist Diener described three components of happiness, and we have gone over this in Carr as well, as the frequency and degree of positive affect or joy, absence of negative feelings such as depression and anxiety, and an average level of satisfaction over a period. Uh, Fisher 2013 talks about spirituality as being concerned with a person's awareness of the existence and experience of inner feelings and beliefs that give purpose and meaning and value to life. So, spirituality, it's been found, helps people to live at peace with themselves, to love God and their neighbor, and for people who don't believe in God, the neighbor is enough, and to live in harmony with the environment. Underwood, 2011, developed a daily spiritual experience scale, which I think would be useful if you round up the members of the Sufi order and give it to them, we might find some things. And this scale, asks questions like, I feel God's presence, I experience the connection to all life. Um, and the Underwood explains that it's possible to substitute other things for other words for God if people are not conventionally religious. They might talk about a higher power or a supreme reality, etc. But Underwood found that often people were a little bit confused by these other terms, and research was initially done in Canada where people seemed to be more comfortable just talking about God. Um, Among the elements in this scale are, I am spiritually touched by the beauty of creation. Again, that's not a sentiment that's necessarily religious. I desire to be closer to God or in union with the divine. That is more religious, but even groups like the Buddhists that don't technically believe in God probably have at least an analogous element in the scale. So this scale has been used in some studies, and a Chinese translation was done, and it was used in a study of 245 Hong Kong professionals, professional and support staff in a rehabilitation services complex. So, daily spiritual experiences were negatively correlated for that group with anxiety, depression, and total burnout. So they seemed to be happier if they had those daily experiences. A study, Underwood says, of Nigerian secondary school teachers demonstrated that daily spiritual experience was correlated with less work-family conflict. So, if somebody has a demanding job, it's common for that to produce tensions at home. There's less of that tension for people who have these experiences. So the scale seems to be producing some correlations between those experiences, which again are at least analogous to the ones the Sufis, or at least many Sufis, put an emphasis on, and uh, well-being. Fisher uh, um, found 2013 that relating with God produced a small but significant explanation of variance in happiness over and above that of personality and age. So let me stop here. We've got half an hour, and I'll come back and we'll finish up in the next section.